Hey guys, welcome to the Smart Venture Podcast. In each episode, we're going to have conversations with some of the top investors, superstar founders, as well as well-known tech company executives in Silicon Valley. We'll have a coffee chat with them to learn their way of thinking and actionable tips on how they build or invest in a successful company. Before we start our show today, I want to make sure the listener, aka you, understand that everything a person say on the podcast only reflects to hers or his own opinion, not the show or the company they work at. Our guest today is the CEO of Meetup. He helped the company grow to more than 44 million members and more than 330,000 groups. Meetup events have been in more than 190 countries in the world. Prior to Meetup, he was a CEO of Investopedia, where he helped the company grow to 4x value to about 36 million in revenue and 30 million user base. Earlier, he worked as the CEO of DoubleClick, president of Seeking Alpha, SVP of 1-800-Flowers. He also teaches entrepreneurship in Columbia University. His name is David Siegel. Welcome to the show, David.
Great to be here. Excited.
To start off the show, can you tell us about how you grew up and how you got into tech?
Sure. I really, a lot of people have these amazing stories about how maybe they were immigrants and they had, some major challenge that they had to overcome. And through that challenge, they ended up, figuring out what the meaning of life was. I've been really blessed, honestly. I had amazing parents who were incredibly loving and a loving family. We grew up in an upper middle class type household. And I was really blessed in terms of everything that my parents, kind of had given us in all aspects of life, and being able to have good educational opportunities, et cetera. I think back to different aspects of my life. And the one thing I would probably point to as a great learning opportunity is at one point in my life, I was very shy and I was terrified of public speaking and just being embarrassed about things. And that's been something that I took some time to get over. But since then, I think because I was so shy or because I was so nervous at times, I'm kind of the opposite of shy now. And I'm extremely comfortable with kind of being myself. And I would say that probably was like the biggest thing I quote unquote had to overcome. In terms of tech, I started off in consulting at a school. I went to a school and had no idea what I wanted to major in. So when you have no idea what you want to do in your life, you just say, I'll become a consultant, because like that just gets to push off the decision even further. And my biggest client happened to have been DoubleClick. And DoubleClick was in the late 90s, like 1997, 98, 99. It was really like the backbone of the internet, because the internet was this free thing. And it was this incredible value for it to be free. And what made it free was the opportunity for having online ads. And DoubleClick was a leader in online advertising at the time. And they were my biggest client. And Kevin Ryan at the time was the CEO. And he ultimately hired me into human resources position, actually, which is atypical to start off in human resources. And then fast forward, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point, but fast forward 23 years later, and Kevin Ryan is the person that acquired Meetup out of WeWork. So relationships matter, should I say.
Wow, that sounds really cool. He sounds like a mentor to you. How do you form these type of mentorship or relationships? When you first meet Kevin, what did he see in you, and how do you maintain these strong relationships?
I mean, mentoring is probably one of the most important things that younger people can do, but it's also an important thing that people who have been working for 10, 20 years should also be doing. And I really do believe that mentors can gain just as much as mentees, meaning a great relationship is not one that the mentor is always like helping a person, but there's great examples of people like Jack Welch, who passed away less than a year ago, former CEO of GE, who used to always talk about he would mentor people, but people would mentor him in learning about the internet or learning about mobile. And there's ways in which people who are being mentored can actually be a mentor to the mentor, quote unquote. So getting back to us, quick story. I was consulting to DoubleClick, and And what happened was Kevin and I built a relationship because I was working with Kevin on building a new performance management plan for the company, the succession planning process for the company, and some other organizational development, human resource strategy issues. And he basically at one point said to me, he's like, "What are you making?" And I told him what I was making. And he knew how much we were billing out as a consultant. And we were billing out like 6 times the amount that I was making at the time because I was fresh out of college. And he's like, "How would you like to have double your salary?" And by having double the salary, DoubleClick would end up saving like over half the money. So, it was kind of a perfect example where there was a quote unquote, intermediary in the market, which is a consulting firm. And they were charging 4 or 5x kind of what my salary was. And both sides ended up benefiting from it besides necessarily the consulting firm. So after I was there for a couple of years before I went to Wharton for business school. And the nature of my job is that I had a lot of opportunity to build relationships with people on the leadership team of DoubleClick. Because when you're dealing with succession planning, you're figuring out who the successors are for key positions. You have a lot of like those kind of meaningful conversations. And I think the key for someone to find a mentor is finding someone who you actually are able to have a personal chemistry with. It's a lot easier to have an ongoing relationship if it's not just about like, oh, this person's really senior, this person can advance my career. There needs to be something more than that. Whether it's, that you both have similar backgrounds, or you have an appreciation for music or for art or for history, whatever the topic happens to be, a personal relationship is actually pretty critical and an ongoing mentoring type dynamic. That's number one. The second thing I would say is that when you're trying to find a mentor, it's actually okay to say to someone, as awkward as this sounds, I would like for you to be my mentor. I would like to learn from you. Would you be open to talking every 3 months, every 6 months, whatever the time period may be? People like you're putting yourself out there. And it's like a vulnerable position to do, to say like, I would like you to be my mentor. I would like to learn from you. But if you don't ask, you don't get. So I've had people come to me and say like, hey, would you be open just talking once every 6 months or once every 3 months for half an hour, for an hour? And then we could talk in between if there's something big going on. I'm like, sure, happy to help you. I think generally the thing that people tend to like doing in senior positions, or hopefully people like doing this, is helping younger people and helping and being able to give advice. I mean, everyone loves giving advice. And that's what mentors ultimately do. So I would just say that Kevin has been a mentor for 23 years. There's another person who was the CEO of DoubleClick named David Rosenblatt, who super close mentor. I probably haven't had 6 months in the last 20 plus years where I haven't spoken to him. And sometimes we could speak 3 or 4 times in a week if I'm, looking about job stuff or other career major issues. And sometimes it might be 6 months or 9 months between, we get together in person. But it's one of the most fulfilling things to be able to have someone like Kevin Ryan or like David Rosenblatt, who is totally unbiased and is just there to like help to make you successful.
Yeah, I really like that you found these people early on in your career. Seems like you found many great mentors from past work experiences. I know that some of our audiences may be entrepreneurs who didn't have opportunities to work with really successful leader yet. What would you do if you were us? Would you try to reach out to someone on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't use LinkedIn. It's not personal enough. If you're going to use LinkedIn, then you have to write a particularly compelling message. Like I have had people reach out to me the typical mention from LinkedIn is, I see you're CEO of blank company, which they just fill in the name, and you've had an amazing career without any details. Would you be open to talking so I could learn more about your amazing career? And it's like, they put no time into it. I've had other emails that have said things like, I just watched a video from a podcast from Grace Gong. I just saw this other video that you were in. I talked to this person that happens to know you, and the thing that struck me the most was XYZ. Would you be open to chatting for 15 minutes? Like, if you're going to use LinkedIn, find a way to send a personal email rather than a message through LinkedIn, because emails tend to work better than messages. And make sure it's like, not just like personalized, but like there's a real reason why you want to have the conversation. And I've done that. I've had lots of people do that. And I would say when people really make an effort, my time's not that valuable. So is my time worth 15 to 20 minutes to help someone else? Of course it is. So, I think it's worthwhile to do it. And just show that you've put the time into really learning as much as you can about a person. So LinkedIn can be decent for that. But I think a better thing is using LinkedIn to see who your contacts are potentially in common, and asking for common contact to make an introduction. That oftentimes is more effective. So still using LinkedIn, but not using LinkedIn to message the person, but it's using LinkedIn to see who you have in common, to see who you could potentially go to. The other thing is, I'm the CEO of this company called Meetup. And by the way, at Meetup, we happen to have we have 330,000 groups, and our biggest group are tech groups, but tens of thousands of groups for entrepreneurs. We've had literally thousands of people meet co-partners, hire employees, figure out who could be on the management team, all because of Meetup. So even if I wasn't the CEO of Meetup, I would say that if you find a Meetup, which there are thousands of, especially in the Bay Area, but all around the country, around the world, that has to do with entrepreneurship, go to that group and try to build relationships with other entrepreneurs, try to move relationships with other venture capital, private equity individuals. And then you have a personal relationship. You're doing it in person. And when you're able to have a conversation in person, which thank God in certain parts of the country, like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, we're able to do more in person. And hopefully in a month or two in California, Texas, Arizona, we'll be able to do more in person. But I would say Meetup is also a great vehicle for meeting other entrepreneurs. And just, make sure you stand out in what you're trying to do. Last story I'll tell you on this particular question is there's a Meetup organizer, and he was telling me that he has two different meet groups. One is a career networking meetup group to help to find a job. The second one was a bowling meetup group because he just loves bowling. So of course, how does it work? He ended up finding his last two jobs from his bowling meetup group. So my point there is that you can build mentoring relationships not in career networking business settings, sometimes more effectively than in career networking business settings.
Totally. I totally agree with you to create some sort of common interest. So you have something that's other than work to talk about. So you don't have to be like, hey, I'm going to do this thing for you. And then you're supposed to, return the favor.
Exactly.
I definitely agree with you.
Foundation of personal relationships, foundation of finding things in common with each other, foundation of people. Because ultimately, mentoring oftentimes is a somewhat philanthropic type activity where you're just trying to help someone. And it's not like a quid pro quo type thing. So you need someone to try to that will want to go above and beyond, which does have to do with a personal relationship.
For sure. I'm sure you have a lot of people coming to you asking for advice. How did your mentees successfully got your attention, and what they do right to form the relationship with you?
Yeah. I probably have had 100+ conversations with different people, let's say in their 20s or earlier in their career, around what they should do and career advice and things like that. But I wouldn't consider that necessarily effective mentoring relationship, because it's really just a one-time or a two-time type conversation. What I think people don't do well frequently, and some do, is to reach out 6 months later, they reach out a year later, reach out 2 years later, reach out 3 years later. So I'm also a professor at Columbia, and I teach entrepreneurship at Columbia. And it's interesting to me, sometimes I'll have a student that I'll have had 2 years prior. And right after the class, let's say they reached out, we went for a breakfast together. And then 2 years later, they reach out again and be like, I just wanted to tell you how I'm doing, get your advice on this other thing. And that's wonderful. But very few people will do the follow-up one a year, 2, 3 years later, because hadn't thought about it or whatever. So I would say the key to a successful mentoring relationship is for it to be ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
Like if it's a one-time thing or even a two-time thing, it's not ongoing. For a person to periodically be like, hey, I'm going through something, really need your quick advice. Would you be able to hop on the phone in the next day or two so that you can help me think through this?
Mm-hmm.
That's like the best type of relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say the people that tend to do things well are the ones that say, hey, would you be okay with, like I mentioned earlier, if every 6 months we tried to get together? And I'm not going to say no typically. I'll be like, sure. And then maybe a quarter of the time they follow up. And then when they do, it leads to like long-standing kind of relationship. So there's someone that I've been mentoring, quote unquote, for close to 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And this particular person, he's been moving up from a job perspective. And I think the mark of a successful one is that on occasion, he'll just call me up and say, hey, can I just get your advice about this really important thing? Because I need to figure it out. And I could use you as a sounding board. Mm-hmm. And I've also used him as a sounding board. Mm-hmm. And then that's a beautiful thing when mm-hmm. kind of a one-sided relationship turns into, like I mentioned earlier, kind of a two-sided relationship. Mm-hmm. And both people can really help each other out. That makes it a lot more sustainable than mm-hmm. just kind of always giving, or one side always taking and one side always giving. I mean, mm-hmm. ideally it should be a give and take, ideally type relationship for to sustain. And sustainability is the most important component to like mm-hmm. a good mentoring type relationship.
Absolutely. Giving advices should go both ways instead of just one person having a lot of input on someone else.
So, and I'll tell you, like there's a person on my team. This is now his third company that has worked for me. There's another person mm-hmm. that also has worked for me for 3 different companies. Mm-hmm. And I think when you have that type of continuity, it makes for, I think everyone benefits.
Yeah, I like that you have people follow you to 3 different jobs. That really says a lot about you. You started your career in consulting. What do you learn at your position? Some of our listeners may be currently in consulting. Can you tell us about how did you leverage your job to make the most out of it? And how do you stand out from your peers?
Yeah. So start with this. I am really not a fan of consulting. I think being a consultant can be very helpful in building the early stages of a career. Mm-hmm. But staying in consulting and constantly just advising companies versus like owning and doing, mm-hmm. Doesn't necessarily make someone more successful when they look to actually move into a company. Mm-hmm. And if someone wants to be a lifelong consultant, sure. For me, I didn't find it personally gratifying. I felt like I was creating at the time binders or decks or whatever, mm-hmm. sharing them, passing them on. Maybe they implement them, maybe them not. But I felt like so much about consulting was trying to get the next consulting gig as opposed to like really help clients, which mm-hmm. did not make me feel good inside. Mm-hmm. So I did consulting for a couple of years and never looked back. And I did a summer internship during business school, and that was that. Mm-hmm. But I would say the best part of consulting is selfish, as bad as that sounds. The first is that you get exposure to different industries. Mm-hmm. You get exposure to different types of job functions. Mm-hmm. And it's like an ongoing education after college. Like I was a liberal arts major in college. I majored in mm-hmm. philosophy, political science, and economics. Mm-hmm. And God, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So consulting was like a further education for me to learn more mm-hmm. about business. So that's one benefit. Again, this is all like the benefit is very selfish for the person. The mm-hmm. second benefit is you build a lot of relationships in consulting mm-hmm. potentially. And like the example that I gave, I got my kind of big job in tech, my first job in tech, because I was consulting and they were a client. Mm-hmm. So I guess what I would say is use consulting to give oneself a myriad of different experiences so you can learn as much as you can. If you're doing some consulting gig and you're working for, whatever, a year, 2 years mm-hmm. more, just fly here, year, 2 years more, actually it's more than a fly, it's like a gigantic bee. And you're on the same exact project and you're not learning new things, then you miss out on that entire consulting learning opportunity. Mm-hmm. And if you're in the back, like if you're like in the back office and you're not getting exposure to clients, you're not meeting lots of people, you're missing out on a major value of consulting, which is the ability to build relationships with clients to potentially help you to find, your next job. So I strongly encourage anyone who's in consulting to try to be as client-facing as possible, building relationships as possible. And the way that, like you asked, how do you stand out? I don't think you stand out in your resume. Again, take it back to the first question. I think you stand out in your relationships that you're able to build. So try to parlay consulting into relationships that can open up different future job opportunities for yourself, as opposed to like turning them into nice bullet points on your resume that are not actually going to stand out in any way, shape, or form from the tens of thousands of other people who are in consulting. You want to stand out? Build relationships. That's my answer.
Relationship building is definitely super important in business. Going back to navigating your career, after working at DoubleClick, you landed a job at Duane Reade. You helped create DR Express. Tell us more about your vision for the company back then and how did you came up with the strategy to change the organization?
Okay, so this is maybe a fun story. So the opposite of consulting in my mind is like you're very hands-off. You're not getting your fingernails dirty. You're not like rolling up your sleeves, quote unquote, and like getting involved in things. So I decided that I wanted to do the exact opposite of consulting, which was retail, actually dealing with physical stores. Duane Reade is a large pharmacy chain in the New York metro area, similar to Long's on the West Coast or Walgreens. Ultimately was acquired by Walgreens like 10 years ago. And while I was in business school, I had this epiphany that the job that I wanted to have was called an assistant to the CEO job, where like you help the CEO with board decks and strategy and like an internal consultant or something, but you're working directly with the CEO because the CEO could then be your mentor. And I wanted this like to be an assistant to the CEO. So I reached out to like 30, 40 different companies and told them I want to be assistant CEO. I ended up with having 10 different conversations with the CEO of 100 Flowers, CEO of Monster, CEO of the NBA commissioner at the time, and a bunch of different companies about being assistant to the CEO. Ultimately, when I graduated from business school, I could only get jobs because it was a tough time. I got 4 job offers and all 4 were in consulting. And I was like, I don't believe this. But then I ended up, and I accepted a job at Boston Consulting Group, actually. And then they gave me a start date that was 8 months after we graduated from business school. So we graduated in May, and it was like in January, February the following year because the economy wasn't good. So what the heck am I supposed to do for the next 8 months? So I went back to a company. I said, okay, Duane Reade, you won't hire me, but can I just spend 6 months being like an assistant to the CEO, for 6 months as a 6-month intern? And I just kind of created a new job, and then I did that. And at the end of 6 months, they were like, okay, we don't want you to leave. We want you to stay. And then I called up BCG and I said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to go to BCG. And they're like, what? How could you do that? How could you leave BCG? It's, you're never going to work in consulting again. You're gone to consulting. And then he said, where are you going? So I said, I'm going to be running business development for a $2 billion pharmacy chain. Then there was a long pause. And then he says, do you think you feel bad enough that you'd be willing to give us some business?
Did you though?
No.
Yeah, of
not
course.
after you just spent time yelling at me about stuff.
Yeah.
So that's how I ended up at Duane Reade, and coincidentally, I ended up getting another job also similar to that, but we're not going to go into that.
That's all we have for today. Don't forget to come back on Wednesday for the second part of the conversation with David. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Smart Venture Podcast. If you like it, please leave us a quick review and hit subscribe so you don't miss any tips from the experts. If you want to receive our updates, please leave your email at smartventurepod.com. If you want to connect with me, all my socials are at Grace Gong GG. Beside LinkedIn, it's just Grace Gong. See you next time.